everyone, Ms. Hanks here. So today we're looking at Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Development Patterns and Processes, but today we're looking at Part 2, Economics and Development. And our objective today is to describe the relationship between economics and the development using real examples. And our objective today is to describe the relationship between economics and development using real examples. Our tidbit of the day is that there is a Swedish word for Friday cozy time, and it's fredagsmys. Fredagsmys? I think it's fredagsmys. Don't speak Swedish. All right, so we're looking at paths to development. So when we got the new millennium back in 2000, the United Nations created something called the Millennium Development Goals. And this is United Nations, the big collection of countries around the world who kind of get together and make global decisions or get involved in things from a global perspective, kind of an international governing body, supranational organization. That's evolved into something called the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a little bit new, a little more inclusive, and their goal is for these to be implemented by 2030. And we're going to go through them, look at all what they have, and kind of think about where we are with these. First one is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Second, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being at all ages. 4, ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. 6, ensure access to water and sanitation for all. 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. 8, promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. And these are continued. 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. 11, make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. 15, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. 16, promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. And 17, revitalize global partnerships for sustainable development. Basically, overall, these sound really, really all-encompassing, and they kind of are. But remember that things like ending poverty looks different in Chad versus Canada. So it doesn't mean we're bringing everybody up to the same level. It just means that we get rid of those extremes. We get rid of that people die because they can't afford food, or people die because they can't afford water or medication. That we're balancing things out so that we are more sustainable as a society, so that we are more equitable as a society, and that we are empowering everyone. So it's kind of a cool idea overall. There's a lot of pieces to it and a lot of parts to it that make it difficult, but also something that we're definitely attempting to work for. So I want you to take a moment and discuss in your notes, how is the world doing so far? How close are we to that? How much progress have we made? Where are we lacking? Maybe what could we do better? What are we doing well? But pause this and take a moment to write some things down. Okay, so yesterday we mentioned the Human Development Index. Today we're going to look at it a little bit more. The HDI was created by the United Nations to measure the development of a country. How do we compare development? How do we say a country is developed or not if we don't have some sort of measure? What do we look at? So overall, the HDI and the United Nations consider developed countries to have a decent standard of living, long and healthy lives among their citizens, and access to knowledge, meaning that they can be educated in some way. Okay. Then we look at another one of these maps. So again, 2014, this is the Human Development Index. Remember that closer to 1 is going to be more developed, closer to 0 is going to be pretty bad. And nobody's at 0, but we do have some that are really quite low. We would ideally shoot for probably a 0.8 or higher, and even a 0.8, relatively, it's definitely lacking some things in there. But notice where our greatest development is and where our least development is. And I want you to think about other things that we've looked at, like population growth and density, agriculture, sustainable versus commercial, our services and settlements, and all of that stuff, our urbanization, all of these things that we've looked at through all of the other chapters. We have something along the HDI called the inequality adjusted HDI, or the IHDI. This essentially modifies the HDI to account for inequality within a country. It says that it's a little bit hard to measure every country against itself, so let's modify it a little bit. Let's make it a little bit more balanced, that we're more measuring kind of against that country itself rather than putting Tanzania against the United Kingdom. Okay? So ideally, the HDI and the IHDI should be the same. Realistically, that doesn't happen. Okay. So remember that the HDI or IHDI is an index. It's a collection of things that says, here's what we can look at, but it's not the indicator itself. It's not what tells us that something is developed. It's the collection of things that we look at that suggest whether a place is developed or not. So for example, we look at a few different things. So dimensions: long and healthy life, access to knowledge, decent standard of living. Well, what indicators fall in each of those? For long and healthy life, life expectancy at birth. If you're only expected to live to be 60, that's pretty bad. If you're expected to live to be 80, it's pretty good. That's really good, actually. In the United States, we have quite a bit of variation, where some of our states, the life expectancy is about 74, and the life expectancy in others is about 78 on average. And that doesn't seem like a huge difference, but that's an additional 4 years. That's a long chunk of time overall. And it's kind of interesting to see that much variation within a single country. For knowledge, the way that we might measure that is the average years of schooling, or mean years, and expected years of schooling. How much do we expect you to get versus how much are you actually getting? And then decent standard of living, we would look at that GNI per capita. That's something that we looked at yesterday. The dimension index for life expectancy at birth is just general life expectancy, knowledge, years of schooling, decent standard of living, income, consumption. And then inequality adjusted life expectancy, education, and income. All of these break down to change and make it the inequality adjusted HDI. So looking at the IHDI in 2012, we have several countries where this very lightest color, we don't have any data, but we have quite a few where, in this case, we're looking closer to 100 rather than to 1. But we see some similarities to that map a minute ago. But also we see some pretty significant differences. Some of them we don't have the data for it, but some of them we do. Look at, for example, Southwest Asia. And look at Southwest Asia here. Lacking a lot of data, but we also see some pretty significant disparity. Or here we're looking at the HDI as of 2011. Again, notice where you see a lot of development versus a lack of development. And here they've put the key on in the opposite direction. Okay. So what are some types of inequality that they look at? They being the United Nations, the people who put together the HDI. And why does it matter? Why do we care if the life expectancy is higher in one country versus another? Why do we care if the years of schooling are different for certain people versus others? Why do we care if we make more or less money or somebody else does? Take a moment to talk about those things, especially for those that don't happen to us. Why does it matter? Okay. So looking at economic indicators of development, first and foremost are the types of jobs. And we talked last unit a little bit about tertiary sector, kind of mentioned the other sectors. Here we're going to look more specifically at it. So the first one is the primary sector, our most basic, primary being first. These are things that are coming from the earth. So agriculture, fishing, mining, lumber, stuff like that. It's coming directly from the earth. Secondary sector is our next step up. This is manufacturing. So we're taking these things that we got from the earth and now we're starting to process them. So fishing, maybe we freeze it or maybe we can it. Mining, maybe we're smelting it down, and yes, that's a word, to go from the raw ore to now some usable resources. They maybe a more refined, the more refined metals. In agriculture, maybe we're processing vegetables, putting them in cans, freezing them, putting them in other food products, whatever we happen to be doing. Then tertiary, this is the one we talked about last unit, is goods and services for payment. So retail, banking, law, education, government, things like that. Anything where we're performing a service and getting paid. Okay. Next up, we look at worker productivity. How much are they putting in for how much is coming out of it? Then we look at access to raw materials. Are they able to get that raw stuff? In less developed countries, often they have the raw materials right there. But in more developed countries, often they're able to more easily access them because they can afford them and pay for them. And finally, availability of consumer goods. So how easy is it to access stuff like this or this computer that I'm recording on, or all the things around me, the stuff that I can just go and buy. I said finally, it's not really finally, but 5. Standard of living, so infrastructure, the basic physical and organizational structures needed for the operation of society. Things like our roads, our hospitals, our police departments, our government buildings, our electrical work, our plumbing, our sewers, all of that stuff is infrastructure. And we essentially need that to operate our societies. So take a moment and discuss infrastructure, or discuss why infrastructure and major economic sector matter for a developing country. What would happen if we changed those? What would happen if we took those things away? Pause this and write it down. Okay. So how does a country become more developed? Well, there's a few ways. The first one is self-sufficiency. So we would encourage domestic production within the country. Remember, domestic means at home, with no international intervention. So a country is doing everything for itself. It is not importing, it's not exporting, everything is for itself. So we have limits on imports, we have protection from international competition, and investments are equal across the country. So little importing, basically no exporting or not being able to import things, so there's not competition. And the investment, we're not just putting all of our money in one place, we're putting it everywhere. But there's some issues. First off, protection of bad business. So if we are protecting, going back to this one, from international competition, it also means that we can have some really bad business practices or really bad businesses, and they're kind of protected because they're within the country. Secondly, we have a need for large bureaucracy. There's a lot of government, there's a lot of paperwork, and it has to be big, overarching, because it's equal across the country. It's all done within the country. And if we're doing this as a whole thing, if we're trying to be this self-sustainable, one big place has to rule everybody. Otherwise, it's going to get really, really unequal really quickly. I will post the link below for this video, so it's going to be in the description. Make sure you watch that. Okay. Secondly, we have international trade, and this is how we open up to international investment, or when we open up to international investment. So we figure out what resources they have that everyone else wants. So if I have a lot of gold in my country, I know that other people want that. Meanwhile, I might have a lot of, like cow teeth, but nobody wants cow teeth. So why in the world would I sell that? They might want other cattle products, but they won't want the teeth because it's weird. but the gold is pretty great. Then we instantly get to put ourselves into the international market. If I have gold and everybody wants that, they're going to buy it. Their gold is a very valuable resource. Even though we have it in multiple places, it's still fairly scarce, relatively speaking, and highly usable. So that's going to get me into the international market really, really quickly. And this is going to promote much faster development because I have lots of international trade and I'm making lots and lots of money. But there are some challenges. So first off, we have uneven resource distribution. This is where we had the even resource distribution with self-sufficiency. With international trade, we have to worry about certain areas, especially things like port cities and capitals potentially having a lot more resources distributed to them than to other areas. We also are going to have a significant dependence on developed countries. If there is no one there to buy our stuff, we're not going to be selling it. And the people who are buying our stuff are mostly going to be from developed countries. And then finally, if we have a market decline, the value of our resources goes way down or potentially goes way down. And that means that, again, we're not going to be able to sell stuff because we're dependent on other places. All right, so continuing on with this part two, but part two for me. So the next way of attaining development is going to be the international approach to winning. So some countries became developed with this. Developing countries have a lot of raw materials that makes them really competitive. They are able to compete against each other, and more developed countries want the things that those developing countries have. So it really relates back to that previous one, but this is taking on a more competitive aspect against one another. And again, I will post this video below. So then we're going to move on to look at Rostow's stages of development. And Rostow is a step system model where we look at societies as they develop, the ways in which they would develop. So we start out with a traditional society. This is a society that has not started development. They would have a very high percentage of agriculture and basically not really be doing a whole lot of anything else. Anything that they do is extremely rudimentary. There is little technology going on with it, and it's really just considered very, very, very basic. Secondly, we get preconditions to take off, and again, thinking step model, and we're going to look at a picture, and it's in your textbook. Second step is the preconditions for takeoff. So we have new businesses, the government is investing in technology and infrastructure, and overall we're getting more productivity because not only are we investing in these things, but now we have people who are working at them, so they are becoming more productive. Stage 3 is takeoff, and this is the rapid development from limited economic activities. We only have a few things going on, but those few things are causing an absolute economic boom, a growth boom. Think Industrial Revolution in the 17 and 1800s, especially in the United States and Britain. 4 is the drive to maturity. This is diffusion of modern technology. There is more growth. There are more skilled workers. They are really getting settled in their development. And finally, we have the age of mass consumption. This is the shift from heavy industry to consumer goods. This is the United States in the 1950s. We are moving out of World War II. We are moving out of that big industrial boom, and we're starting to get into consumer goods. We're starting to get marketing. We're pretty mature. We have all of this stuff going on for us as far as development goes, and really we would be considered very developed at this point. So it would look like this. You have 1, the traditional society, and again on our x-axis we're looking at time, on our y-axis we're looking at the level of development. So part 1, traditional society. 2, preconditions for takeoff. 3, takeoff. 4, drive to maturity. 5, high mass consumption. So for those of us in the United States, this is today. Okay, so how do we get money for development? You could do it in a few ways. One of the easier ways to do it, rather than just making all of it and having all of it to start with on your own, because that's pretty difficult, would be to get loans. And there are a couple of structures, a couple of organizations that help to loan money to countries. The first one is the World Bank. And the World Bank loans money to developing countries to help them with their infrastructure. It's helping them to get stronger, it's helping them to become more stable in a very indirect way. The second one is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And this loans money to stabilize the country's economy. So this is specifically about developing countries, helping with infrastructure. This is particularly about that country has an unstable economy, and the IMF is helping to step in with a loan to stabilize the economy so they don't become a failed state. Okay, so I want you to take a moment, discuss in your notes, what are some challenges that organizations like these might face? So IMF and World Bank. Okay. But most of the projects through these loans fail. It's a very unfortunate fact. We have faulty engineering, countries might misuse funds, or we may have corruption and the funds are stolen. New infrastructure does not attract other investments, but the overall final piece of this is that all countries are in a lot of debt. So we hear about it in the United States quite a lot. Oh, the national debt, this, the national debt, that. All countries are in debt. We borrow money from each other. It helps us to build relationships. It helps us to have an investment in each other so that we are supporting each other and each other's success. There's more to it than that, but those are kind of the basic things. But it makes it really difficult sometimes too, because with everybody in debt, sometimes it might be hard to borrow from someone else. You might be struggling to get funds in some way or to use funds in some way. Okay, and then we have the dependency theory. So this says that this is the reason why developing countries are so poor, it says this, is because developed countries exploit them. And this is the case. So we think about this with the world systems theory. The core always exploits the periphery. In this case, developed countries always exploit developing countries. That's business. You don't pay someone too much because you want to make the most money possible. So when you take raw materials from a developing country, you're going to pay them as little as you possibly can, which is exploitative. And we are going to have workers who are in incredibly dangerous situations, who make very little money, sometimes forced or child labor, and the cycle kind of just continues. So with this idea of exploitation, we have this concept, and we talked about this with agriculture, called fair trade. And you will often see one of these symbols, especially this one right here, the little black and white one, on certain goods. Particularly, some of the ones that we really see are chocolate and coffee, also tea. But these often are goods that come from less developed countries, agricultural products that come from less developed countries. They are grown on plantations, and the concept of fair trade is the commerce where products are made and traded according to standards that protect workers and small businesses in developing countries. So basically, the idea is that you pay them a fair wage so that they can afford to pay workers more, so that the workers can get health care, they can get time off if they need it, whatever it happens to be, they can support their families. They're making a fair income. It also means that when we get the end product in the United States or other places, that it's more expensive. Fair trade coffee is more expensive than conventional coffee. Fair trade chocolate is more expensive than conventional chocolate. But both of those things, and we talked particularly about chocolate in class, can be created. The process often uses forced and sometimes child labor. And fair trade helps to combat those types of things. Also, reminder that if you have a fair wage to start with, there's going to be, in general, less overall child labor because children are not having to work also to support their families if their parents are making fair wages. Okay, so there is another concept called the Brandt Line, or the North-South Line, and this is developed by a guy by the name of Willy Brandt in 1980, so still during the Cold War. And this line divides the wealth according to the North and South. So it looks like this. You have the rich North and the poor South. You take your line, you draw it through the United States between us and Mexico. You bring it all the way around, kind of keep Europe in here. Pretty much exclude most of Asia. Swing around Mongolia to bring in Japan, and then all the way around to bring in Australia and New Zealand, because remember that these are countries that were settled by Europeans, and therefore they are going to tend to be richer. I said settled, I mean colonized. So I want you to take a couple minutes, and as you end this up, describe the relationship between economics and development using real examples. So think about what we talked about today. Think about your own understanding and knowledge. Think about what you've done in your text, and talk about this a little bit. Use those real examples. It's really important that you understand this concept and can pull real world stuff here, okay? And that is it for today. So make sure you go back, rewatch anything that you missed. Make sure you're reading in your textbook. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.